The dawn broke reluctantly over the rain-soaked fields of Normandy, a pale light pushing through heavy clouds as if afraid to reveal the devastation beneath. Mist hung in patches above the bocage, clinging to the hedgerows like smoke that refused to die. The distant rumble of artillery rolled in from the east, muffled, slow, and deliberate. It was June 12, 1944, less than a week after D-Day, and the land was still waking from centuries of quiet farming into the sudden, merciless age of mechanized war. On a gentle rise south of the village of Le Desert, 5 Sherman tanks sat in disciplined silence. They had pushed through the night to support the men of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, who were preparing to strike at a hidden German anti-tank nest that had stalled the advance towards St. Lo. The Sherman's mutts, plattered their olive-drab camouflage dulled by rain, appeared almost dormant like hulking animals resting before a charge. But inside each steel-hull crews prepared for the coming storm with cold precision. Inside the lead tank call sign Fox 2, the air was thick with the smell of oil canvas and sweat. A faint electrical hum filled the turret, a soft vibration under the boots of the crew. It came from the one device that set these American tanks apart from their German adversaries, an unassuming metal box fixed beneath the commander's seat. The SCR-508 radio. A machine capable of doing something German tankers still could hardly imagine, allowing armored forces to coordinate instantly across the battlefield with clarity and speed. Lieutenant James Hawk Haldane, the tank commander, leaned over the receiver, listening to the quiet static. He was 28, from Omaha, Nebraska, and the son of a lineman who had spent his life wiring telegraph poles along the flat horizon of the American Midwest. To Haldane, communication was oxygen. Silence meant danger. Broken signals meant death. He understood what many German crews still didn't. The greatest strength of the Sherman wasn't its armor or gun, but its voice. The gunner, Corporal Nolan Brooks, sat with one hand resting on the elevation wheel of the 75mm cannon, his other drumming nervously on the metal by his knee. Dialed into the same frequency, he could hear fragments of transmissions from other tanks in the platoon, each message crisp and controlled. Eagle 1 moving, Eagle 3 holding position, recon sighting to the west. The Germans, by contrast, often fought with a single radio set per platoon. Sometimes only the commander's tank had one. Orders passed by flag horn or shouted word. Once the shooting began, their formations scattered like broken glass. Brooks knew this. Every tanker did. The hills were still quiet. Too quiet. Haldane pressed the throat mic against his neck and whispered into the transmitter all Eagles report. A chorus of voices followed, each clear despite the rain, each traveling through miles of airwaves without distortion. Engines rumbled to life. Tracks clattered softly as they shifted into position. The entire armored column moved with a silent coordination that would have been impossible without the radio. The morning fog stirred. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow ahead, a German Panzer Roman 4 waited with its long-barreled 75mm gun pointed directly at the gap in the trees. Its commander, Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner, watched the terrain through a pair of field glasses. He was seasoned, confident, and deadly. But he fought with one hand tied behind his back. His radio was overworked, crackling with interference barely adequate for the chaos that was coming. He had no idea that 5 American tanks were speaking to each other like parts of a single machine. A single raindrop slid down the barrel of Fox 2's main gun. Seconds later, the first German shell screamed out of the tree line, a flash, a crack, and a plume of dirt exploding just yards short of the lead Sherman. Haldane did not flinch. He pressed the mic again. Contact front. All Eagles spread and fire on my mark. There was no hesitation, no confusion. The tanks moved instantly as though they shared the same nervous system. To the Germans watching from the hedgerows, it looked uncanny. American armor shifting in perfect unison, reacting to fire with a speed that felt almost supernatural. They could not hear the voices inside the Shermans, the calm synchronized commands flowing across the SCR 508 network. They only saw the results. Haldane raised a hand. Mark, 5 cannon blasts shook the ground. The hedgerow erupted in flame, and the quiet Normandy hill finally woke to war. The storm that had swept Normandy in the early days after D-Day had done more than churn the sea and scatter the mulberry harbors. It had reshaped the tempo of battle across the hedgerow country. The Americans were learning painfully that the Bocage favored defenders, especially German defenders, who knew how to disappear into the dense, winding natural fortifications that carved the land into a maze of green walls and narrow killing ground. By June 1944, German forces in Normandy, units such as the 2nd Panzer Division, the 352nd Infantry Division, and scattered elements of Panzer Lehr were fighting with a grim determination. Many of their tanks were veterans of the Eastern Front, their crews hardened by years of brutal combat. Their defensive positions were expertly laid out, using every hedgerow bank and sunken lane as an ambush point. It was a battlefield built for patient hunters, not for advancing armor. Yet, beneath their discipline and experience, the German units shared a problem that only grew worse as the Allies pressed inland. They were fighting death. By mid-1944, shortages in materials, interference from Allied air power, and overextended supply chains meant that German armored formations were chronically under-equipped with radios. Even elite units often had a single transmitter per platoon or company. Most tanks carried only receivers. Others had none at all. To coordinate in battle, they still relied on hand signals, flags, or shouted commands methods that disintegrated the moment gunfire began. In contrast, nearly every American Sherman tank arrived with a full set of communication gear. The SCR 508 intertank radio for platoon level coordination, and the SCR 506 for long-range communication with battalion command. The system was rugged, reliable, and easy to operate even under fire. The interior of each tank was wired like a small command center. Headphones allowed every crewman to hear the commander. The commander could speak to every tank in the platoon. And the platoon leader could coordinate with artillery, infantry, or reconnaissance units with a speed the Germans found bewildering. This technological edge was not born from battlefield brilliance, but from peacetime foresight. In the late 1930s, the U.S. Army had recognized that future warfare would be mobile, mechanical, and fast. Armored forces would need to talk constantly. So they invested early in a new generation of FM radios, rejecting the older AM systems that German forces relied on. AM signals were prone to interference. FM signals remained clear even in the chaos of combat. The difference was dramatic. German tank crews frequently found themselves firing at enemies they couldn't see, reacting to threats they only partially understood, stumbling blind through fog, smoke, and confusion. American crews, meanwhile, could relay a single spotted German gun to every friendly tank in seconds. They could call in artillery within a minute. They could coordinate flanking maneuvers with infantry who were still 1,000 yards away. This advantage grew sharper in the Bocage. Normandy's hedgerows broke the battlefield into tiny compartments, fields isolated by thick walls of earth and tangled roots. Tanks disappeared from sight within seconds. Infantry units became scattered. Visibility collapsed, but the radios did not. A Sherman platoon could vanish into separate fields and still move like a single organism. A German unit could be wiped out before the commander knew who was shooting at him. This asymmetry of communication was the invisible engine powering the American advance. And yet, even with this advantage, the battle in Normandy was grinding, brutal, and slow. The hedgerows took their toll on both sides. American tanks were ambushed at point-blank range. German Panthers dominated long fields when they could find them. Mortar fire and snipers turned every corner into a deadly question mark. For the 2nd Armored Division advancing south towards St. Lo, the objective was clear: break the German defensive line before it solidified into an immovable wall. But every step was fought for. Every minor rise, every farmstead, every narrow lane had to be cleared by blood and steel. And so, on the morning of June 12th, Haldane's tank Fox 2 and the rest of his platoon were given orders to assist the 41st Armored Infantry Regiment, which had run into a well-camouflaged anti-tank strongpoint near the desert. A single German Panzer Roman 4, supported by a 75 mm pack gun and infantry with Panzerfausts, had stalled the American advance for hours. Casualties were mounting. The infantry could not move until the armor moved, and the armor could not move until the threat was removed. It was a familiar war equation, but this fight would hinge on a factor the Germans did not yet understand. The Americans already knew exactly where the Panzer Roman 4 was hiding. They knew because the reconnaissance scouts had radioed its position directly to Haldane's tank minutes earlier. They knew because the platoon leader had broadcast the coordinates to all Shermans simultaneously. And they knew because within each tank, the commander repeated those same details to every man wearing a headset. The Germans, unaware they had been fully exposed, waited for the Americans to blunder into the kill zone. They did not yet grasp that the U.S. Shermans would be entering the ambush with their eyes wide open. Across the fields, the fog began to lift. The German positions remained hidden, their camouflage blending perfectly into the hedgerows. But the American tanks were not searching blindly. They were hunting with a shared vision, a networked mind, a synchronized purpose, something the German tankers watching through their slits could not comprehend. The quiet hum of the radios inside each Sherman was not just background noise. It was the sound of a new kind of warfare. It was the sound of an armored fist preparing to strike, guided not by sight, but by communication swift, precise, and devastating. And as the platoon of Shermans rolled forward, their engines low and steady, they carried more than steel and ammunition. They carried an advantage that would shape the outcome of the battle, and soon the war. The rain eased as morning advanced across the hedgerows, though the sky remained a dull, sullen grey. A thin column of steam drifted from the exhaust of Fox 2 as its crew waited for the signal to advance. Inside the tank, lit only by streaks of pale daylight leaking through the periscope slits, Lieutenant James Haldane stood braced against the turret ring headset pressed firmly to his ears. His world was a confined dome of steel, far smaller than the sweeping fields outside, but infinitely more dangerous. Haldane was not a man who raised his voice even in battle. He had learned early in the war that calmness was not simply a matter of temperament, it was a leadership tool. Men trapped in armor felt everything more intensely, every jolt, every clang, every vibration from tracks grinding over stones. Fear inside a tank found no place to escape, it multiplied. A commander who shouted fed panic. A commander who spoke with clarity dispelled it. He had cultivated that calm through experience, though the experiences that shaped him had never been glamorous. Haldane had enlisted long before the first Americans landed in North Africa. He had trained in the blistering heat of Fort Benning, where the dust clung to his boots and the days blurred together under the monotony of drills. The Army in 1941 was still an organization learning what it meant to wield armor. Tanks were few, complaints were many, and the doctrine was still being hammered out on chalkboards and training grounds. But Haldane found purpose in the work. He had grown up in the shadow of steel, watching his father repair telegraph lines that stretched like metallic vines across the plains of Nebraska. As a boy, He had listened to the crackling of Morse code echo through his father's small workshop. That rhythmic hum of communication, the invisible threads connecting distant towns, had fascinated him. It was a world where silence meant more than words, and where clear signals could change everything. When he became a tank officer, he brought that understanding with him. Tanks, like telegraph lines, needed connection. Without it, they were isolated, blind, and doomed. While other commanders focused first on gunnery or driving, Haldane obsessed over the radio, its maintenance, its wiring, the clarity of its transmissions. He was known for lifting the receiver during every pause in training, as if listening for ghosts in the static. "War is confusion," his father once told him. "Your job is to pull sense out of the noise." Inside Fox 2, that philosophy guided every decision. His crew trusted him implicitly. Corporal Nolan Brooks, the gunner, was the youngest of the group, but possessed an unshakable steadiness behind the sight. He had a talent for falling into a sort of trance during combat, breathing, slow finger poised lightly on the trigger, mind focused on the small illuminated crosshair inside his periscope. To him, the world narrowed during combat until only the target remained. The loader, Private Sam Rizzi, occupied the cramped space to Brooks's left. A former dockworker from New Jersey, Rizzi moved with surprising grace inside the steel cage of the fighting compartment. He could ram a 75 round into the breech in 3 seconds flat, even when the tank lurched violently. He joked little and prayed often, and though he rarely spoke during battle, his hands never faltered. Behind them, down in the belly of the tank, the driver, Corporal William Mac McGrath, and his assistant driver, Private Earl Thompson, sat shoulder to shoulder. McGrath had the hands of a craftsman and treated the Sherman's transmission like a living thing. He could coax the 30-ton vehicle through mud, over ditches, and around obstacles that would have trapped a lesser driver. Thompson, quiet and watchful, manned the bow machine gun and served as McGrath's second set of eyes. Together they formed a single organism, a tank crew, bound by trust, experience, and the narrow corridors of steel that encased them. But Haldane was the mind, and the radio was their voice. As the mist lifted, Haldane leaned forward, adjusting the SCR-5, 108's frequency dial with 2 fingers. A faint crackle whispered across the headset, followed by the calm voice of Captain Derek Walsh, commander of the platoon. "All Eagles stand by. Artillery confirms target coordinates. Fire mission incoming in 2 minutes. Recon reports enemy armor remains stationary." Haldane closed his eyes briefly. Good. The German Panzer Roman 4 hadn't moved since dawn. He keyed his mic. Fox 2 copies. Crew prepare for advance. Around him the tank stirred. Brooks steadied the gun. Rizzi checked the next round. McGrath tightened his grip on the control levers. Thompson slid a belt into the bow gun. But even as they prepared, Haldane's thoughts flickered just briefly toward the men they were about to face. He had fought German armor in Tunisia and Sicily. He had seen their discipline, their ingenuity, their stubborn courage. He harbored no illusions that the enemy would break easily, but he also understood something that many American commanders did not. The Germans were fighting without the one advantage his crew relied upon most. Haldane had witnessed German tank platoons splinter under the stress of battle, because only the leader's tank had a transmitter. If he was hit, the rest were as good as blind. He had seen panzers signal each other with colored flags, only for the message to be lost in smoke and dust. He had even watched a German commander climb halfway out of his turret to shout orders, only to be struck by a sniper's round. War punished those who could not communicate, and today would be no different. He opened his eyes, time to focus. Calling over the intercom, he spoke with the steady cadence his men knew well. "Brooks, we fire on my command. Rizzi, keep the rounds coming. McGrath, we move on Eagle One's mark." Thompson watched that right hedgerow. A chorus of quiet affirmations filled his headset. Then a new sound rose through the turret walls, distant thunder rolling from the north. Artillery. American shells began falling on the German position beyond the hedgerow. The ground shuddered. Smoke plumes blossomed above the trees. The air trembled with the rhythm of delayed explosions. Haldane felt the moment settle. This was the hinge between preparation and action. He keyed the mic again as the artillery barrage began to lift. All Eagles advance. The engine roared. The Sherman lurched forward, and Lieutenant James Haldane, the man shaped by wires and signals, led his crew toward a battle where communication would be the clearest weapon they possessed. The ground trembled under the weight of the Shermans as they pushed forward, their tracks crushing wet soil and broken branches beneath the rhythmic churn of steel. The artillery barrage behind them faded into distant echoes, low rolling thuds swallowed by the dense hedgerows. Smoke still clung to the treetops ahead, drifting in slow ghost-like curls. The morning fog, once a blanket over the fields, now peeled back in thin sheets, revealing the first hints of the German killing ground. Inside Fox 2, perspiration beaded on the steel walls despite the cool air outside. The interior vibrated softly with the hum of the engine, the whir of the turret traverse motor, and the constant faint whisper of radio static. Lieutenant Haldane's voice cut through the headphones, firm and steady. Eagles shift left, stay tight, Fox 2 taking point. The entirety of the American line moved at once, 5 tanks adjusting their angle like a single living thing, their actions synchronized through unseen waves of radio transmission. The Germans, watching from the hedgerow, saw the sudden shift and felt a cold unease settle in the pit of their stomachs. Tanks weren't supposed to move like this, not so cleanly, not so perfectly in step. From the shadowed slit of his Panzerroman Force Cupola Oberfeld, Rebel Karl Brenner tracked the American formation with narrowed eyes. His field glasses trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that his ambush might not unfold as planned. He had predicted confusion, scattering, perhaps even hesitation. Instead, the Shermans advanced in a deliberate, unified line. He muttered a low curse, they knew. Brenner slapped the shoulder of his gunner. "Stand by, wait for my order, let them come." The Panzer's long 75 mm gun lay hidden behind a dense tangle of brush, perfectly camouflaged. Perfectly still, on Brenner's right flank, the dug-in Pak 40 anti-tank gun sat, poised, its crew kneeling low, waiting for the sight of American armor to crest the rise. Across the field, Haldane adjusted his periscope. Through the narrowing mist, he caught the faintest unnatural line in the hedgerow ahead, a horizontal shadow too straight to be a branch. A gun barrel. He exhaled slowly, target ahead. Brooks traverse 2 degrees right. "Hold fire!" Brooks rotated the turret with smooth precision, his finger resting lightly on the trigger butterfly. The loader Rizzi already had a high explosive round cradled against his shoulder, ready to ram into the breech. The tension inside the tank thickened, the kind that pressed against the chest and made time sluggish. The fog thinned one last time, and the battlefield snapped into focus. The German ambush roared to life. A blinding flash burst from the hedgerow as the Panzerroman 4 fired. The shell screamed across the field and slammed into the glacis plate of the lead American tank Eagle 1. Sparks burst in a spray. The shell failed to penetrate, but the impact rocked the Sherman violently, sending its turret off balance. Almost simultaneously, the Pak 40 opened fire, its thunderous crack splitting the morning air. A jet of flame leapt from the hedgerow, followed by a second shell that tore into the earth just behind Eagle 1. Haldane didn't flinch. He keyed his mic. All Eagles returned fire. The battlefield erupted. Brooks fired immediately. The 75 mm cannon in Fox 2 let loose with a thunderous blast that shook the turret. The shell streaked across the clearing, striking the hedgerow in a shower of shattered wood and scorched brush. Rizzi had another round loaded before the shell impacted, Up, fire, another blast, another eruption in the hedgerow. Two Shermans on the left flank angled out, firing into the suspected position of the pack gun. Their cannon blasts overlapped in a rhythmic, punishing cadence. Dirt and smoke billowed upward. To the Germans it felt impossible. The American response was instantaneous, coordinated, each tank adjusting position, each cannon aligning on target without pause. Brenner shouted into his radio, but the line crackled with interference. His supporting gun crew was shouting over each other. Chaos seeped in. Inside Fox 2 calm order reigned. Haldane tracked the muzzle flashes through the periscope. Brooks shift fire left, look for that pack. Brooks swung the turret a few degrees, scanning the smoky wall of brush. Thompson opened up with the bow machine gun, stitching the hedgerow with bullets in long, controlled bursts. Then there, a flicker, a glint of metal through drifting ash. Haldane's voice was a low command. Fire. The third shell from Fox 2 ripped into the hedgerow with devastating accuracy. A fireball bloomed behind the brush as the Pack 40's ammunition detonated. Flames punched skyward. German voices cried out and fell silent, but the battle was far from over. The Panzer Roman 4 fired a second time. This shell streaked toward the American flank, slamming into Eagle 3. The armor buckled, the tank lurched, and thick black smoke poured from its engine deck. A desperate voice crackled over the radio. Eagle 3 hit. Bail, bail, bail. Haldane clenched his jaw. Friendly casualties. The Germans were striking back with precision. McGrath, he said into the intercom, advance 10 yards. Give Brooks a clean angle. Fox 2 surged forward. The Panzer Roman 4 now revealed itself, fully breaking through its camouflage as Brenner issued the order for rapid fire. The long 75 mm gun recoiled again, smoke curling from its muzzle, but Fox 2 was already in motion. Brooks lined up the shot. Steady, steady, he exhaled. On, Rizzi slammed another shell into the breach. Up, Haldane's voice. Fire. The Sherman's cannon unleashed its fury. The shell struck the Panzer Roman 4 squarely on the turret ring. A plume of flame erupted as the German tank shuddered from the impact. Its turret froze halfway through rotation. For a moment it seemed to hold together, then orange fire licked through the cupola and smoke billowed from its vents. Inside, Brenner made one last attempt to open his hatch, but the blast had warped the steel. The Panzer Roman 4 burned. Silence slowly reclaimed the battlefield. The remaining German infantry broke and ran, fleeing deeper into the hedgerows. The Shermans held fire. Smoke drifted over the burning wrecks, mingling with the lingering fog. The ambush had been shattered not because of superior armor or firepower, but because the Americans had responded as one, their movements guided by constant, precise communication. Inside Fox 2, Haldane lowered his headset slightly, letting the cotton padding rest against his temples. His voice remained steady, but a weight pressed behind it. All Eagles, cease fire, report damage. The radios crackled with survivors' voices. The price had been paid, but the line had held. And the battle for Normandy had taken one more small, brutal step forward. The battle had lasted less than 15 minutes, a quarter of an hour compressed, violent, deafening, then gone, leaving only silence and the smell of burning metal drifting across the Normandy fields. The American advance stalled since dawn by the ambush near Le Desert began to move again. But victory in the hedgerows never came cheaply, and this morning was no exception. The smoke from the destroyed German positions mingled with the fog, forming a low grey curtain that clung to the ground. The wreck of the Panzer Roman 4 burned fiercely, its ammunition occasionally detonating with sharp metallic cracks. The hedgerow where the Pack 40 had once stood smouldered in a charred crater, jagged roots jutting out like broken ribs. The cries of wounded infantry had faded. Now only the settling of debris and the faint hiss of fire filled the air. Inside Fox 2, the atmosphere was different. Not triumphant, never that. Just quiet. Focused, heavy, Haldane breathed slowly, adjusting the headset against his neck. Sweat had begun to cool along his collar. His men waited for instructions, their breathing audible in the close confines of the tank. "Status report," he said. McGrath's voice came first, steady as ever. "Tracks intact, engine good, no hull damage." Thompson added quietly, "Coaxial's hot. Bow gun's fine. I'll change belts once we halt." Brooks, the gunner, leaned back in his seat, sighing. His hands were still trembling from the recoil. Gun's good, sights clear. Rizzy wiped soot from his palms, shaking out tension. Plenty of rounds left, ready to keep going. Haldane nodded to himself. The crew had held together. But the platoon had not escaped unscathed. He keyed the radio. "Eagle 3 report, static." Then a faint, strained reply. "This is Eagle 3. We're out. Hit bad. Crew's clear." In the distance, Haldane saw 3 figures scrambling away from the crippled Sherman, its engine deck charred, black smoke curling from the hull. The tank was finished, but the crew was alive, and in this war that counted for far more than steel. "Roger, Eagle 3. Medics are en route. Hold your position." Haldane's tone remained even, but inside a familiar weight settled in. He had lost enough comrades to know how fragile survival was. A solid hit from a German 75 mm could send fire ripping through a Sherman in the space of a heartbeat. Today, the crew of Eagle 3 had been lucky. Fox 2 rolled forward, clearing the last stretch of the field. The other surviving Shermans spread out, forming a loose perimeter, while infantry from the 41st Armored Infantry Regiment advanced through the smoke. The infantry moved cautiously, rifles raised, scanning for any remaining German stragglers. One of the sergeants approached Fox 2 and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Lieutenant, that pack nest is finished. We're moving up the line. Command says thanks, you boys saved us a bloody hour." Haldane leaned halfway out of the open cupola, the breeze cooling the sweat on his brow. He nodded once. "Glad we could help, Sergeant." The infantry pushed on, disappearing into the next hedgerow line. Their footsteps faded quickly, absorbed by the thick Normandy earth. For a moment Haldane simply watched the battlefield. The fog had finally lifted. The fields, littered with burning wrecks and scattered fragments, lay exposed beneath the grey sky. A gentle wind rustled through the tall grass, carrying with it the faint smell of gasoline and charred rubber. War was never quiet for long, but in this lull the land seemed to hold its breath. Behind him, Brooks climbed partway from the turret, letting the cool air wash over his face. "Hell of a morning," he murmured. Haldane didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the burning Panzer Roman 4. The Germans had fought well-disciplined, hidden, precise. It was the kind of ambush that had cost American armor dearly in the opening days of Normandy. But today something had shifted. They had beaten the ambush because they were never truly caught in it. A soft crackle filled Haldane's headset. "Captain Walsh, Fox 2, this is Eagle 1. Good work out there. Recon confirms enemy withdrawal toward the south. We push again in 20. Understood, Captain." Haldane lowered himself back into the turret. His men sensed the shift instantly. Rest time was over. "Crew," he said, his voice carrying a steady resolve, "check systems, then reload. We'll be advancing shortly." Inside the tank, the crew moved with practiced efficiency. Thompson swapped ammunition belts. Rizzy restacked the remaining 75 mm rounds in neat rows. Brooks inspected the gunner's controls, fingers tracing over switches and dials. McGrath adjusted his gloves, his foot already resting lightly on the accelerator. The rhythm of preparation was as familiar to them as breathing. Still something lingered in the air, a realization not spoken aloud. They had survived because of coordination, because of clarity, because of that faint electric hum in their headsets. The Germans had been brave, but bravery could not overcome silence. Outside the tank, the wind shifted again. Smoke curled upward from the Panzer Roman 4, rising slowly into the grey morning sky. A few German uniforms hung from branches, burned shredded. A helmet lay upside down in the mud. Even the hedgerows, those ancient walls of earth and vine, seemed scarred and blackened. The infantry reappeared, guiding the wounded from Eagle 3 toward the rear. Medics followed with litters. The slow procession wound back through the fields, moving past Fox 2's position. Haldane watched them go, the weight of command settling deeper on his shoulders. He knew why they had to push forward so quickly. The American advance towards Saint Lo could not stall. Every delay gave the Germans more time to dig and more time to reorganize, more time to strike again. And the hedgerow country was full of men like Brenner, disciplined, dangerous, patient hunters. But today the hunters had been outmatched by something they could not see, a hidden advantage, a quiet force shaping the battlefield from within the steel walls of every Sherman. The radio systems had turned 5 tanks into one, had turned chaos into coordination, had turned a deadly ambush into a shattered German line. As the platoon prepared to move again, Haldane lowered his headset, listening to the faint hum inside the steel walls. It was more than sound. It was the heartbeat of their survival. The winter sun weakly pierced the cloud cover above the Scheldt, casting pale light across a landscape still scarred by months of battle. Mud flats glistened where the tide had retreated. The wind dragged the scent of salt and distant cordite across the shattered embankments. The guns were silent, now replaced by the steady churn of Allied supply barges moving up river, a sound unthinkable only weeks before. For the first time since June, there was no German artillery watching the channel, no machine gun nests overlooking the locks, no mines drifting in the tide. Antwerp, the port that Montgomery had demanded open, was finally alive with movement. Lieutenant Jack Foster stood on the pier, the collar of his greatcoat turned up against the wind. His bandaged left hand hung at his side, still stiff from the shrapnel that had torn through it during the last push at Walcheren. He watched as a British hospital ship glided slowly into the harbor, its white hull streaked with rust, its Red Cross symbols faint beneath the morning mist. Around him, Dutch civilians worked alongside Canadian engineers, clearing rubble from the waterfront. They formed a line handing broken bricks and timber from one to the next. None spoke much. Words felt too small for what the island of Walcheren had endured. Foster let the wind carry the noise of the port into the quiet of his mind. Hundreds of vessels were moving through Antwerp, now Liberty ships, tankers, barges, troop carriers, all snaking their way deeper into liberated Europe. When the first convoy arrived, naval officers had cheered openly. Some wept. Everyone understood the magnitude. Every ton of ammunition, every fuel drum, every ration crate that was unloaded in Antwerp meant that hundreds of trucks no longer needed to crawl across the deadly supply bottleneck from Normandy. The war which had stalled at the German border could now move again. He looked down at the temporary cast on his hand and flexed it. The doctor had told him he would recover, but the nerves might never feel quite right again. It didn't matter. The men he had led, the last 11 survivors of his original platoon, were resting now, their ordeal finally over. Some were expected to return to the front. Some would be sent home for good. Foster himself did not yet know where he would be sent next, but he understood that the battle for Walcheren had marked him in ways deeper than wounds. Behind him, a seagull cried from the rooftop of a warehouse, its wings beating hard as it circled a patch of sunlight reflecting off the water. Foster closed his eyes. He could still see the flooded fields of Walcheren stretching out like a drowned world. He could still hear the staccato rattle of German MG-42s firing from half-sub. Merged bunkers, the sharp metallic echo bouncing across the waterlogged terrain. He remembered the cold, the way the tide forced them to fight in rising seawater, up to their waists, the heaviness of his rifle soaked in brine. But more than anything, he remembered the faces of the men who had not returned with him. Sergeant Miller, who led the first charge across the breached dike. Corporal Dawson, who drowned when he slipped from a collapsed rooftop during the storm tide. Young Private Connolly, just 18, who had volunteered to carry the signal line forward under fire, only to vanish in the smoke and mud before anyone could reach him. Foster carried every name every moment. The war would take many more before it ended, but he would not let these disappear into statistics. Footsteps approached slowly behind him. Captain Hargreaves, his company commander, stopped beside him. The older man's face was drawn, his uniform still caked with the fine grey mud of Walcheren. "Supplies are coming through faster than expected," Hargreaves said quietly. "Montgomery's staff is already planning the next moves toward the Rhine." Foster nodded, watching a cargo net swing from a crane. "Walcheren made the difference, sir, even if no one remembers it." Hargreaves breathed out heavily. "They will. Perhaps not in speeches, perhaps not in books. But every man fighting past the German frontier will feel the weight we lifted here." For a while they stood in silence. A column of American trucks rolled along, the key engines rumbling as they moved toward the depot area. British MP guided them through the traffic. The war machine, once starved, was feeding again. Hargreaves placed a gloved hand on Foster's shoulder. "Rest while you can. There'll be more battles. The Germans aren't broken yet." Foster allowed himself a thin smile. "No, sir, but they're running out of places to hide." The captain left him there alone with the wind and the sound of distant cranes. Foster gazed across the harbor toward the direction of Walcheren, far beyond the horizon. He imagined the flooded villages, the broken trees, the shattered bunkers half covered in silt. It was strange to think that not long ago that island had determined the fate of the entire northwestern front. Now it lay ruined, reclaimed slowly by the tide, its defenders buried beneath mud that had swallowed the last of their resistance. A Dutch boy no older than 12 approached timidly and offered Foster a small paper cup of hot coffee. The lieutenant accepted it with his good hand. The cup shook slightly from the cold, from fatigue, perhaps from the quiet weight of memory. The boy smiled shyly and walked away. Foster took a sip. The coffee tasted bitter, strong, and very real. In the days that followed, Allied commanders would call the Battle of Walcheren a necessary victory, essential, decisive, costly. Historians would later describe it as one of the war's most complex amphibious assaults fought in a landscape transformed into a lagoon. But for the men who fought there, it would be remembered more simply. It was a place where soldiers waded through seawater and shrapnel to break open the last gateway to victory. A place where courage was measured not by triumph but by endurance. A place where the sea itself seemed to resist the Allied advance, only to finally give way. And for Lieutenant Jack Foster, it would remain the moment when the vast machinery of war was revealed in its true nature, not a clash of grand strategies, but a struggle carried on the backs of ordinary men, soaked in saltwater mud, and fear pushing forward because the world behind them needed them too. As another convoy entered Antwerp's harbor, its horns echoing across the cold morning, ere Foster set his cup down on the railing. He straightened his coat, turned toward the assembly point, and walked away with the quiet determination of a soldier who understood his place in a story far larger than himself. The wind swept across the water, carrying with it the faintest scent of the open sea, the same sea that had tried to stop them, and the same sea that now brought the supplies that would help end the war. In the end, Walcheren had been more than a battle. It had been a reminder: victory is built not only on strategy but on sacrifice, and history moves forward only because someone somewhere is willing to walk into the storm. The evening tide crept slowly across the estuary, its dark waters rolling over the mudflats with a quiet patience that seemed almost ancient. The last rays of daylight sank behind the warehouses of Antwerp, casting long shadows across the docks where Allied soldiers moved like silhouettes in a world struggling to return to normalcy. Cranes groaned, ropes tightened, and the metallic clang of cargo rails echoed across the harbor, the steady rhythm of a continent beginning to breathe again. Far off beyond the line of masts and derricks, the North Sea lay calm. The same sea that had battered the Walcheren dikes with merciless force only weeks before now stretched out in silence, as if exhausted by its own fury. The war was still raging across Europe, but here at the mouth of the Scheldt the storm had passed. The cost had been counted, and the gates to victory had been forced open, A thin haze of coal smoke drifted between the ships. Lanterns flickered along the pier. Refugees returning to their homes walked among Canadian patrols, carrying blankets, sacks of bread, and small bundles of whatever belongings they had salvaged from months of occupation. A Dutch woman paused near the edge of the quay, staring across the water as if searching for something she had lost in the long darkness of war. Perhaps a loved one. Perhaps a memory of a life she once knew. War had a way of erasing the most familiar things. Lieutenant Jack Foster watched the scene from atop a stack of supply crates. His hand, still wrapped in bandages, rested gently against the collar of his coat. He had grown thinner since the landings at West Capel. There was a hollowness around his eyes, a quiet tiredness that came not from sleepless nights, but from the lingering echo of all he had seen. Like so many others, he was learning how to live after a battle that had demanded everything. A group of Canadian sailors passed by, laughing softly, as one of them carried a tin of biscuits under his arm. It was a simple moment, unremarkable save for the fact that laughter felt almost strange in a place where until recently death had been a constant presence. Foster listened to them fade into the distance. He wondered how long it would take before he could laugh without remembering the faces of the men who would never share such moments again. The harbor lights flickered to life as night settled in. A convoy of trucks rumbled down the pier toward the inland roads, each loaded with crates bearing white stencil letters, ammunition/rations/medical supply. A British sergeant waved them through, the engine's growled headlights sweeping across the cobblestones. Somewhere in Germany, American and British soldiers were preparing for the winter push toward the Rhine. Somewhere in Belgium, armored divisions were bracing for a counterattack that none of them could yet foresee. Antwerp would feed them all. Foster slid off the crates and walked to the edge of the dock. The planks creaked beneath his boots. A cold wind swept in from the northwest, carrying a faint chill from the open sea. He inhaled deeply and let the air settle inside him. It tasted of salt and smoke, the taste of the Scheldt, the taste of Walcheren, the taste of sacrifice. Behind him, Captain Hargreaves approached with a folder tucked under his arm. His steps were firm, deliberate, the stride of an officer used to bearing responsibility. Orders came in, Hargreaves said quietly when he reached Foster's side. Your platoon will reassemble at the staging area tomorrow morning. We move east next week. Foster nodded. There was no question, only acceptance. Understood, sir. Hargreaves hesitated, his breath frosting in the cold. You did well, Jack. Your men speak highly of you. They say Walcheren would have taken longer without your lead. Foster shook his head gently. We all paid for Walcheren, sir. Every man who went ashore. I was only one of them. The captain clasped a hand behind his back. He seemed to search for words, then gave up and simply nodded. Rest tonight. Tomorrow we begin again. When Hargreaves left, Foster remained standing at the water's edge. He stared into the harbor where the reflections of ship lights trembled across the surface. The tide washed softly against the timber piles below. The murmurs of soldiers and dockworkers blended with the distant hum of the city, a quiet chorus of life returning. He thought of the island, the flooded fields, the drowned farmhouses whose rooftops peaked above the tide like gravestones. He thought of Corporal Dawson slipping beneath the seawater, of Connolly vanishing in the smoke, of Miller falling on the dike. Their voices were gone, but their stories lingered in the spaces between each memory, in the silence after each breath. War was a strange thing. It consumed cities, armies, and nations, yet its truest legacy lived in the hearts of the few who survived. Men like Foster carried the story forward not as heroes but as witnesses. An Allied tugboat pushed past the pier, its horn sounding a long, low note across the darkened water. The ripples spread outward, distorting the mirrored lights until they broke into scattered fragments. Foster watched the waves for a long time. He wondered how history would remember all this, the flooded island, the bitter dike fighting the men advancing chest deep through freezing seawater to open a port that would shorten the war. There would be archives, reports, and maps, perhaps a small mention in the years to come. but the true weight of Walcheren, the weight he felt now, could never be found on a page. It lived in moments like this, a soldier alone on a quiet dock looking back at a battle that had changed the course of the war and changed him with it. Far along the pier, the Dutch woman lifted her child into her arms. The boy pointed at the hospital ship entering the harbor. Its lights glowed softly through the mist. Foster exhaled and finally turned away from the water. He walked slowly toward the barracks boots, tapping against the wooden planks. Behind him, the harbor continued its steady rhythm, cranes lifting ships, mooring engines turning over. War had taken much, but here in the heart of Antwerp, something had returned, a sense that despite the darkness, the tide was finally shifting. And as the night deepened over the Scheldt, the same truth settled across the harbor, across the ruined island of Walcheren, across every battlefield from Normandy to the Maas. The road to victory was long. The cost had been immense, but because men had fought through salt water and fire to open this one harbor, the war would now move toward its end. The tide rolled in again, calm, steady, relentless, washing over the scars of battle, as if nature itself understood that the world was beginning to rise from the ruins. And so ends the story of Walcheren, not as a tale of glory, but as a testament to the quiet courage that carries nations through their darkest hours.